Good day. My name is Michelle Lavander. I'm the director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us today for our Health Matters webinar, Suspended: Student Mental Health and Unequal Discipline. School suspensions have surged since the pandemic in parts of the country. Many schools are short of staff and struggling to support young people who are wrestling with a range of mental health challenges. In too many cases, suspensions are the easy way out for overburdened teachers and administrators. But there's ample evidence that such forms of school discipline aren't effective, and they can have harmful long-term consequences on the health and academic future of students. And suspensions are not doled out evenly. In Missouri, for instance, Black students serve 36% of all days in suspension, despite making up only 15% of the student body. These long-running disparities remain despite persistent efforts to close the gaps. And there are other approaches that have been shown to work if schools get the resources and support they need. We'll also talk about why that could be an uphill battle in today's rapidly shifting political climate. In today's webinar, we'll hear from reporters doing important work on child mental health and school discipline. We'll explore alternative approaches to school discipline, and we'll highlight story ideas that can be applied virtually in any school district in the country. We're joined by three distinguished speakers. Cheyenne Mumphrey is a national reporter with the AP who covers education. She joined the AP in 2019 and was most recently a regional text editor. She's a journalist, photographer, and illustrator, and has years of social media and video experience. Her work is premised on the belief that schools are meant for everyone, but not designed for everyone, and she tells stories exploring the impact of that gap. She's a member of several journalism organizations, including the Education Writers Association, National Association of Black Journalists, and Society of Professional Journalists. She's based in Phoenix, Arizona. Jessica Seaman is a K-12 education reporter for the Denver Post. She joined the Post in 2018 as a health reporter and took on the education beat in 2021. She covered the coronavirus pandemic, and her story about a Colorado teen with long COVID was named a Livingston Award finalist in 2022. Jessica led the Post's Crisis Point project on teen suicide as a Center for Health Journalism 2019 National Fellow. She's also now a 2023 Data Fellow at the center with her current project, which she'll be speaking about today, that focuses on the rise in school suspensions in Colorado. A native of North Carolina, Jessica joined the Post after reporting stints in North Carolina and Arkansas. We'll also hear from Rachel Pereira, a fellow in the Governance Studies program for the Brown Center on Education Policy at Brookings. Her research examines how racial and socioeconomic inequalities develop in K-12 education and the consequences of policies designed to reduce educational inequity. Her current work focuses on civil rights in education, school discipline, and COVID-19 recovery. She also studies the politics of education policymaking, examining issues related to private school choice and charter schools, as well as school boards. This webinar is made possible thanks to the generous support of the Kirsty Hammond Fund for Health Journalism. We'll be archiving this conversation later today at centerforhealthjournalism.org. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our speakers first, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for questions. Please feel free to share general comments as well, or any technical issues in the Q&A. And now let's just get underway with this fabulous panel. I want to start out with Rachel. Help us ground our conversation today by walking us through some of the relevant history on school discipline and suspensions. How have the patterns evolved over time on suspensions, and how have things changed since the pandemic?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here with you all today. If you could pull up the slide I shared. I wanted to start here. This graph shows out-of-school suspension rates over time since 1973, which is the earliest we started collecting at a national level data about out-of-school suspensions through the federal civil rights data collection. And we see a couple of patterns here that I want to highlight to foreground this conversation in sort of a broader understanding about the policy trends that have contributed to the discipline problem and persistent and ubiquitous inequalities in discipline rates. So we see that suspension rates have been increasing steadily for decades. They've tapered off over the last decade or so, but we saw really marked increases between 1973 and 2010. We see that racial disparities in suspensions, particularly for Black students, have always existed, and that as suspension rates increased, racial disparities widened. And while these data are only showing suspension rates by race and ethnicity, we know that there are also very stark inequalities based on gender and disability status. And when we consider these aspects of student identity together, we know, for example, that Black boys with disabilities have some of the highest suspension rates on record. And so, when we're talking about suspensions and discipline, it's really important to take that intersectional lens. Now, if you're asking yourself, why did suspension rates increase? There's a lot to this story, and I could spend a lot of time trying to unpack the different factors and trends that have contributed to rises in suspensions and rises in inequality in suspensions. But I'm going to try and hit on just a couple that I think are important, again, for the broader context of this, what I think is a very pressing education policy problem. So one, we know from empirical research across many decades that as schools integrated racially and as they integrated students with disabilities, because keep in mind that students with disabilities, by and large, did not have access to public schools before the early 1970s. And so as schools integrated on these dimensions, suspension rates for those groups increased. You see really clear increases in suspensions as desegregation is taking place. And what's worse, research shows that those increases in suspension gaps were durable. So they didn't close, 4 or 5 years later. And so, another way that education scholars think about this is as second generation segregation. So as schools became integrated, schools found ways of segregating students internally through tracking and through discipline policy that was disproportionately affecting racially minoritized students. We also know that as the school system integrated, the Black educator workforce was decimated. And we know from a lot of empirical research that Black kids, for example, are far less likely to be suspended when they are taught by Black teachers, when they are in school systems and schools that have Black school leaders. In the 1890s, in the 1980s and 1990s, we know that things like the war on drugs, the proliferance of zero tolerance policies in both the criminal justice system, but also in the school system had huge implications for how school level discipline policy changed and in ways that led to increases in zero tolerance policies, which, for those who may be new to thinking about these problems, zero tolerance policies is this sort of idea that if we are, we apply harsh punishments to even trivial infractions, we can try to deter kids from misbehaving in more serious ways. And what we know from the research is that these types of zero tolerance policies that proliferated in the 1990s, in part because of some legislation during the Clinton administration, the 1994 Gun-Free Schools Act is really important to this story. We again saw really sharp increases in suspension rates and expulsions. Now, over the last, I'd say 15 years or so, we've started to see a shift in the discipline policy landscape that I think is really consequential for thinking about some of the challenges today. There's a growing consensus in the education research community that suspensions don't work. They're not effective at any of their stated goals, and they have harmful short and long-term consequences and in racially disparate ways. We know that they exacerbate inequality. And so what you start to see around 2010 is states and school districts start to change their school discipline policy to put limits on the use of suspensions and promote alternative, less punitive approaches like restorative justice programs. LAUSD was one of the sort of early adopters of these policies. California was the first state to make statewide policy change. We also saw federal guidance during the second Obama term, where there was an effort to reinvigorate federal civil rights enforcement to remedy racial discrimination. And so there's been this sort of wave of policy action over the last 10, 15 years, but now I think we're at an inflection point where the pandemic has created acute challenges for schools, both in terms of student need and in terms of, educator workforce shortages, educator burnout. And we're seeing reports of worsening student misbehavior, increasing suspension rates. All the while, some states and districts are still in the middle of trying to reform school discipline policy. And so it's having the effect, given that the implementation of these reforms has been uneven. We know that they've been successful in some places, but not all. That we are seeing some states like Nevada, Kentucky, Arizona roll back on those reform efforts because they're coming to the conclusion that the reform efforts aren't working. Although I would argue as a researcher, they're coming to those conclusions prematurely, given that they are trying to implement these changes during sort of acutely challenging moments without sufficient resources. But nonetheless, we're now seeing, I think, a bifurcation across states and localities where some places are really doubling down on these investments in alternative practices, and others are returning to more punitive approaches. And so I think, we're at a challenging moment in this space, but the broader sort of history and context is helpful to keep in mind as we're navigating these policy discussions.
Thank you, Rachel. That's an incredible overview. You packed in a lot in a short time. Cheyenne, I want to turn to you. You've reported in depth on these persistent racial disparities in school suspensions and on the long-running attempts to narrow the gaps. Walk us through your reporting, what you've learned as a national education reporter covering them in terms of, what's driving them and this frustrating pace of progress that Rachel alluded to.
Yeah. Again, thank you for the invite. I'm really excited to speak on this topic. Can everyone see the slide there? Yes. Okay, awesome. So I did not make this visually appealing like Rachel did. So I'm going to talk through this, but feel free to take a moment to read some of this data in more detail. Ultimately, the bigger picture and some of the reporting that I have done on this issue is that progress has been made and it exists. But there are really massive disparities for Black students. A lot of the reporting that I've done has stemmed from what does it look like to talk about segregation and what does it look like for Black students? Has any progress been made at all? And what does that look like? And why has progress been slow? So as you can see here, from a national perspective, I'm only going to pull out a couple states here. So California, you saw suspension rates for Black students fall, but it's still 3 times higher than their white counterparts as well. In Minnesota, again, suspension rates have fallen for Black students. They fell, but it's again still 3 times the Black student share of the population. So you're still seeing, these disparities in numerical sense, like this is something to pay attention to. What I want to note, as Rachel sort of alluded to already, is that during the pandemic, some of these suspension rates nosedived. But you have to be careful in reporting that out, right? Because a lot of students weren't in school during that time. And so it's very clear that this is, you have to look at it holistically and kind of look prior to the pandemic and kind of what's happening now. Same for Missouri and Louisiana, it's not, from a numerical standpoint, it's not looking good in terms of the actual punishment now for students compared to like the progress that's made, right? It's not a one-for-one comparison in that regard. What I would say in terms of the things that I found, just in talking to students and being on campus, is that a lot of what we're finding is that there's minor incidents that are escalating because there's policies that are vague, they're subjective, and it really does require the administrators who are enforcing these policies to make decisions based on their own, biases or own ideas of what punishment should look like. Some districts have designations in terms of what punishment looks like. You might hear the term, they've been placed in a group fight, or they, are causing harm to other students. Like there's very different classifications of infractions that require different responses from those faculty. And the faculty have the ability to then decide what that punishment looks like from there when there's no clear cut rule on what enforcement actually looks like from a district or a state level, and possibly even a federal level. So with that being said, and with that in mind, there are advocates who are targeting these underlying biases in enforcement of these policies. The argument in a lot of these cases, you'll hear the phrase school to prison pipeline. a lot of the enforcement of these policies is actually fueling this school to prison pipeline. And that the idea, if you have not heard of this term, is that, you know, once you are kicked out or drop out of school, it increases your chances of criminalization in adulthood. You are more likely to be arrested or, you know, face criminal prosecution for just having gone through some sort of punitive process prior to that. So a lot of what I've been looking at in terms of, you know, reporting and talking to students and talking to families is how do we address this issue of you punishment first and then behavior modification as a last resort. And so you'll hear us talk a lot today about, you know, adultification of children, punitive punishment, restorative justice. You'll hear a lot of these terms, and ultimately what it comes down to is how do we minimize the disparities against Black children, but also not just Black children, right? We're talking about a wealth of intersection of identity. Rachel alluded to, you know, disability, gender, race. There's also, you know, economic status, and where you go to school also does matter. And so, you know, in doing some of this research, we've also stumbled across what are alternative schools, which are, you know, this often considered a solution to a lot of behavior modification issues and ideologies here that we'll also get to. What I will say on that front is I don't know of any like full national data that looks at alternative schools yet. I know there's a lot of work being done in this space on analyzing if alternative schools are actual solutions to the problem. What I've found through a lot of my reporting is that the alternative school is actually that experience of being in an alternative school doesn't match the actual intent of what the school was designed for. A lot of students are going through these programs and realizing that it's making the matter worse. The behavior is not actually being addressed in any way, and it's causing issues related to lower grades, lower graduation rates, issues with mental health, which we'll also get to today. But that's kind of like the general overview of some of the things that I've been looking at. I don't want to like jump ahead because I know we'll get to some of these things, but that's ultimately, you know, some of what we'll be talking about more throughout this conversation.
Thank you so much, Anne. And before I turn to Jessica, I just was hoping you could give a quick thumbnail definition of some of these terms, just because they're kind of bandied around a lot, but I'm thinking adultification and restorative justice in particular.
Yeah, so adultification is this idea that adults that are, you know, sort of carrying out some of the enforcement of these policies are looking at children and not seeing children, right? It's this idea that, you know, you're old enough or you should know better, and when in reality there's no that idea is grounded in a lot of you know, stereotypes of different communities. A lot of and this can be seen in a lot of different ways. One of the stories that I've recently worked on related to you know, dress codes and hair policies for students. And sometimes, you know, adults might see a kid and think, oh, well, you're old enough to know better. And that just doesn't necessarily work across different sort of intersections of identity. Michelle, can you repeat the other?
Oh, the other one was just restorative justice, because I almost feel like it's a buzzword. So, and I know it's a huge topic, but just a quick, just to help those who aren't, you know, writing on this stuff or reporting on this every day, like how might that play out if, you know, a kid, I don't know, one kid punches another kid or something in a restorative justice setting versus, you know, just suspending.
Right. So restorative justice is really this idea of like, you know, I like to think of it more as like behavior modification as it relates to racial demographics and understanding of culture identity and the ways in which cultures play out. There's a lot of different I guess like research that goes into what restorative justice actually means, but I would say from my perspective and the ways in which we've reported this out is just a more direct approach to changing behavior before criminalizing that behavior. So basically leaving room for kids to be kids, right? You can say, I'm trying to think of an example here, so my apologies for stumbling a little bit. But I would say, you know, if a kid punches another kid, you know, instead of directly sending them to suspension, I would say, you know, having that conversation, taking the time to understand the underlying problem of why this kid feels the need to have a reaction that impacts another kid in that way. Sometimes you might run into, with a story that I did on the Native American community here in Arizona, there's conversations of, okay, well, did you get enough rest? And are you seeing violence at home? That means that you are now understanding that violence is an option when it really shouldn't be an option. So those are conversations that are actively happening. And in terms of like the racial part of this, is that you know, the understanding of culture and underlying issues that might be at home that are impacting how you're responding in school is what a lot of adults might be missing in that regard, which is why, you know, we talk about biases in enforcement, because some adults may just not know or understand what you know, conversations could be happening at home that could be impacting their response to a situation. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful. And you're reminding me of something a school psychologist told me, which is that when an incident occurs, instead of asking the question, you know, like, you know, why did you, you know, screw up and do this thing? It's like, what happened to you today, or what's happening at home?
Right.
So you start with a different question, to your point about, did you get rest? And, you know, did you have enough to eat? And, you know, sometimes some very basic things that didn't happen for that kid before they got to school. Jessica, let's turn to you. You're in the midst of a data-driven deep dive on school suspensions in Colorado as a data fellow with our center. And what is your reporting finding about the patterns and causes in your state, and which kids are you seeing are most at risk of being suspended?
Hi, thanks for having me. If you can show my slide, that will help me talk about things. So as Michelle said, I started covering K through 12 in 2021, which was really when we started seeing kids return to school in person. And so as already been noted, we saw suspensions dip as kids were in remote learning. But when they returned, we saw a big increase, enough that here in Colorado, suspensions reached an 11-year high and suppressed pre-pandemic levels. And so it wasn't just a return to suspensions, it was a really dramatic increase. And I wanted to figure out, why is this happening? And so what I noticed was that the increase was really driven by out of school suspensions rather than in school or classroom removals. And so this was a more severe form of punishment that takes kids out of the building and not just the classroom. And I found that most of the suspensions were also for nonviolent behaviors. So things like substance use, disobedience, which is a very vague term, and poverty destruction are among reasons why kids were getting suspended. And so in terms of looking at why was this increasing, you know, as kids returned to school, what we also saw, schools were really struggling to staff classrooms, support staff. They didn't have enough substitute teachers. They didn't have enough bus drivers. And so what we saw is, as these staffing shortages increased, so did suspensions, particularly as schools struggled to hire enough mental health professionals and teacher aides or paraprofessionals and special education specialists. And so that's really important, because these employees work with students with disabilities, as noted, who have higher suspension rates. And so my data analysis found that districts with a shortage of special ed providers or paraprofessionals had a 40% higher suspension rate than those that were fully staffed in those positions. And I also found that districts with a shortage of school psychologists and social workers had a 24% higher suspension rate. And this was a change during the pandemic as well. because before the pandemic, that staffing shortage didn't really seem to matter as much as it did after kids returned to school. And we know that during the pandemic, kids were struggling more with trauma, they had grief, they missed out on a lot of socialization that they were used to as well. Did I get all your questions, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's turn back to Rachel. You've shared that the conversation about school discipline and suspensions is really rife with fallacies, and maybe walk us through some of that, some of those examples that stand out in your mind, and also just what tips you have for reporters so that they can identify and avoid misleading narratives.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk to you all about this. So I think, like Jessica said, I think it's really important to keep in mind that most school discipline issues are non-violent, non-dangerous, regular things you should expect from kids. And like, yes, they're getting worse given what we know about the youth mental health crisis, but like I'm a parent, children are going to push boundaries, right? And so we have to, I think it's important to foreground conversation about school discipline policy in the types of misbehaviors that school discipline policy is intended to address. School violence, while certainly an issue and far too prevalent, is extremely rare in the sense that, you know, most school discipline policy is not about, you know, preventing a school shooting. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind, in part because we know that there's a disconnect between the types of schools where school shootings occur and the types of schools that historically have bared the brunt of harsh, punitive disciplinary policies, right? Most from the Washington Post database, we know that most school shooters are white. Most homicides that occur in schools occur in majority white schools. Yet schools that have metal detectors, schools that have like these, you know, sort of hardening measures, those policies are found in majority non-white schools. And so there's this real disconnect, and I think it's important to keep that in the conversation. You know, I think another sort of fallacy, I'm not sure if it's a fallacy, but something I have learned in my research is that there are a couple of things going on that I think are important to keep in mind, but educators have beliefs about student behavior that are often disconnected from what we know in the research, what neuroscience would tell us about children's brains and how their brains work, to Cheyenne's point about adultification. There's this sort of belief that children can, they can do what we want them to do if we make the like threats harsh enough. But what folks in this space will often say is that behavior is skill, not will. And so there has to be a reminder. I think reporters really have to keep in mind that like some of the ways that you'll hear educators, education leaders, or even policymakers talk about, you know, the purpose of suspensions or what they intend suspensions to do, like we really have to question some of that logic, that underlying logic of what they see as the goal of returning to punitive practices, because the logic is rife with fallacies and it's not well grounded in any type of research.
And Jessica, how did the pandemic, in your mind, in your findings, change the relationship between students and teachers and school staff? And why was that loss of support staff that you walked us through so consequential for some kids, in terms of the approaches a school might or a district might take if they're shorthanded, when kids act out, and you know, what happened to the, you know, these alternative approaches that Cheyenne was talking about?
Yeah, so one thing I hear from students, teachers, parents, really anyone who's in a school is that students' sense of belonging really went away. And so they no longer had this connection to their school that they might have had otherwise. And part of this was because they were remote. And then we also saw that they were missing out on milestones. That's pretty typical for children and teens. So they miss prom, they miss graduation and homecoming. And these are things that really help them, according to mental health professionals, have a clear idea of their sense of identity. And so they missed out on all this. They're kind of growing up by themselves, and then suddenly they're back in school. And that sense of I belong here really went away. At the same time, you have teachers who are short-staffed. And so they're exhausted, they're burned out, they're dealing with their own trauma from the pandemic as well. So then they see a behavior that they might have not otherwise seen because students are struggling with their like emotional regulation. So that behavior looks 10 times bigger through their lens because of what they're going through themselves as well. And so we saw, even though we saw most suspensions are for these lower level behaviors, what teachers will tell you is what that means for students coming back into the classroom is they struggle more, students struggle more with conflict. And so conflict that might have normally been resolved with, between students through talking can turn into a fight. And then on top of that, you have the staffing shortages. And so you have the mental health professionals or the teacher aide who might be working with these students to build connections. They're not there. And so they don't have that relationship to kind of intervene and work with students to make sure that they can stay in the classroom and that things don't escalate to the point that a student's getting suspended from school.
Yeah, and one of the things, Jessica, you have in one of your stories, you quote the chief of staff of Denver Public Schools saying, and you're kind of addressing this, when kids don't have a trusted adult in the building that they connect with, that's difficult for them. And I'm just wondering for Rachel and Cheyenne, how does that and what Jessica's describing in Colorado correspond to what you're seeing nationally? And Cheyenne, what kinds of steps are forward-leaning schools taking to better support kids who are otherwise at risk of discipline?
I'm happy
Go ahead,
to get
Rachel.
started. I think this is where programs like restorative justice really show promise. I think a lot of the programs, based on my work, a lot of the through line in a lot of the programs that show promise, like restorative justice or positive behavioral interventions, focus on building relationships in the school community, focus on building stronger relationships with teachers and between teachers and students, building stronger trust. Restorative justice has a big emphasis on sort of the preventive, building conflict resolution skills between students, building that sense of community. And so I think that these programs can really address some of these issues that we're seeing come up in schools, but some of the challenges that Jessica mentioned in terms of like schools being short-staffed really come into play here, because restorative justice, like how you approach discipline and everyday behaviors, takes more time and takes like a completely different orientation to thinking about student behavior and relationships and prioritizing the relationship potentially over other things. And so I think the conditions are very challenging to implement some of these programs. And I think another sort of complicating factor is that the teacher prep programs, I think, haven't kept a pace with the sort of new approaches to discipline. And so you have this big gap with teachers' ability and their preparedness to handle some of these issues coming out of their preparation programs.
Yeah, and to that point, it just adds one more thing that teachers have to do, right? So a lot of the argument of why it may not be feasible to do this, or a lot of these programs end up being temporary, is because of the timing that it takes to actually implement some of these things. I will kind of pivot a little bit just to talk, to my reporting in Indigenous communities on this subject is, some of the solutions that I've seen kind of that have been successful, like, yeah, they're restorative justice practices, but they're also just like community building. Like that trust is so key. And that's what we're seeing, across the board nationally, is that when discipline is addressed in, or I should say when behavior is addressed in a way that's meant to actually help students overcome that behavior and address the actual cause of that behavior, we're seeing that families are more excited to send their kids to school, students are more excited to go to school, relationships with students and their teachers and administrators are better. You're starting to understand that, or families are starting to understand that, like, hey, not all teachers or not all principals are out to get my student. And that trust builds a lot more, it builds a more collaborative effort in schooling, right? It starts to bleed into other topics in education, not just behavior. we're talking about addressing basic needs as well. When we talk about homelessness, or student homelessness, we're talking about, food insecurity. Like a lot of these things have this idea, this underlying idea that trust is necessary. And, from the reporting that I've done in a variety of different, pinpoints of this discussion, that's been the common factor.
And if I could call on both Cheyenne and Jessica, and you kind of touched on this earlier, Cheyenne, when you talked about the school to prison pipeline, but just wondering what you're finding, both on a kind of your own research, but also on an anecdotal level. Both of you have some really interesting stories of interviewing, young people and children, that once a student or a child is suspended. I mean, I realize students a child, but I'm talking about younger kids too. We're not just talking about adolescents in high school. If once they're suspended or expelled or otherwise kicked out of the classroom, that's more likely to happen again. And so I'm just wondering, if you could kind of help us to paint that picture and some of the long-term consequences for those students of color who are disproportionately impacted.
Yeah, I would say, I'm thinking of two students that pop up to mind immediately, that I was able to kind of center these stories around. And in one case, we have a student who has not really, he's never been suspended and never's been expelled before, and got in a fight that he, this is a matter of he said, she said, right? But he had got in a fight that he was defending himself, and the administration had labeled it a group fight, which in a lot of cases has remnants of gangs and territorial implications, and so that punishment is often steeper. And what happens is a kid will get a punishment, and immediately the fear of that kid kicks in first. And then what happens from there is like there's a question of, okay, but is what I did wrong? Should I have not defended myself? There's internal questions of like, how do I protect myself and my safety? And what do I do in situations where I feel threatened or misunderstood or not listened to? And then you have, that mental battle that's going on in that kid's mind. And so then when they, when family finds out, family is always going to really take the stance of being protective over their child. And so that family then goes to school to ask, what can I do? What can be done in the future? How can we avoid this? What can I do at home to make sure that, I'm instilling whatever belief or, solution in my child so this doesn't happen again. And so then from school perspective, it becomes a matter of, sometimes a matter of student safety. And so then you have the conversation, like there's just a little bit of a disconnect there in terms of like the actual reasoning why they're having these conversations in the first place, right? And so, long term, especially if they get sent to, if that punishment is escalated to, say, an alternative school or say an expulsion, you have issues of validation and self-worth that these students are going through, right? Like, am I worth it? Do they not care about my education? Should I even be going to school? And then there's questions in that regard to like, well, I'm being criminalized and penalized for something that shouldn't have never really escalated in the first place, but sometimes often does based on, what we talked about in terms of adultification. So yeah, I mean, the long-term consequences of that, we talk about, if a kid is suspended or they're expelled, those grades tend to drop. The rate of graduation or the potential to graduate is sometimes often not there anymore. And so, or if it is there, it takes longer to get that degree. And then you have those conversations of whether or not it's worth it. And then what does higher education look like? What are my opportunities for higher education when, they start to creep in this idea of like, okay, can I even get into a school if I have disciplinary issues? Should I even try to get into school? Is it worth getting into school? Am I going to go to that school and have similar disciplinary issues to contend with? And a lot of times those kids are either drop out, or they are, dealing with a lot of issues and building up their transcripts so that they can get into higher ed. And so then you have this, ripple effect of what a student's options are after. And this is not in every case, of course. You have students who get punished and they're like so freaked out to get punished again, they whip in shape and they're good. But that's not often the case, especially when you have, money is a huge factor here, right? Like how much resources are poured into a lot of these school programs to actually help and give enough training to teachers to then implement this in a better way. There's a lot there. But generally, there are some long-term consequences that do actually impact not just a student's education long-term, but just their feeling of place in society, and what sort of options they have. A lot of this, school is, as much as it is about a place of learning, it's also about a place of preparation for the workforce. And if you're penalized for, not following the dress code, and you get suspended, then again, ripple effect. So that's like kind of the overview of what I'm seeing from students that I've spoken to. And a lot of it's just hard. Like you don't want to be taken out of class. You don't want to be separated from friends. And missing, we talk about chronic absenteeism a lot, but missing one day of school might be okay. But if you're suspended for a week, if you're suspended for a month, there's some serious consequences in terms of your academic outcomes.
Thank you. And you talked about younger kids too. I mean, but what would you want to share about all this?
I found the same thing that Cheyenne said, that where students really internalize when they are suspended from school. I spoke to a teenager named Joey who was suspended, including out of school, because of vaping and marijuana use. And when I asked him how it made him feel, he told me it felt like he was failing, not just as a student, but as a kid. And, that's a pretty heartbreaking quote to hear from someone. And he talked about how he felt like he had a reputation at the school for always getting in trouble. And so it kind of sticks with them. And that's a pretty common thing. What my reporting found was that, it's not just teenagers who are getting suspended. It's also young kids, as young as kindergarteners. I spoke to kindergarten teachers who described how one of them said in her classroom, she had a kid with disabilities, who was supposed to have a paraprofessional or a teacher's aide who is supposed to help him with his schoolwork because he can feel very overwhelmed. And this is pretty common after the pandemic. Students know they're struggling with school academically and that teachers are trying to get them caught up. And so, there's a lot of pressure that they feel even at the elementary school age to do well. And so what this kiddo would do, he would flee the classroom because he would feel overwhelmed, is what she told me. She had a classroom full of kids. And so when that para wasn't there, they didn't have someone to go get the kid. And so what they would do is suspend the kid because there was nothing else, no other way to support the child without the proper staffing. And so it's something that even from a young age, we start to hear kids are experiencing and starting to internalize of, oh, I'm a bad kid because of this happened, or my teacher doesn't like me.
That's a really heartbreaking example that really shows this kind of collision of the staffing and the need of a child. Yeah. We're going to open it up to our questions. We have a bunch already, but I did want to ask both Jessica and Cheyenne about tips before we do that, for just reporting strategies. And Cheyenne, you've said that for you, it's very important to center your reporting on the voices of students. And I know, Jessica, you think really deeply about just how you approach kids who are in these vulnerable situations. So maybe just ask both of you for some insights, and then we'll open it up to all the questions we have. And please add a question if you haven't done so, and we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Yeah, I can get started. A lot of the work that I do and then our education team does at the AP is really do center the voice of students and try to get that experience, straight from the source, right? And so what that means and what that looks like as a reporter is really having to get on the ground, be in classrooms, talk to teachers, talk to students, talk to families. And it's easier said than done, right? Like it does take time. It takes an investment in the communities that you're covering to make sure that you are not going in with even just like general bias, right, about what a community might be going through. And so for me, if you're some places that I've found helpful to look for sources has been social media and just your general network. What that looks like is social media maybe is not like the go-to place as much as it used to be, but you can look at parent groups. People are very vocal about exploitation and discipline, and what families are going through is very real. And oftentimes they want a place where people are listening and paying attention. And sometimes that's in, group places, right? Like online group spaces. And so you have Facebook groups from parent Facebook groups. You have even just like third-party agencies and advocates and nonprofits who are in this space who have heard from people on the ground. For me, it's a little bit of an overarching thing because I cover national news. And so it's not as simple as just like going to your neighborhood park sometimes. But sometimes you might have to, right? Every family that you encounter and you speak to for a story, and for those who aren't journalists, just general people that you might encounter on a day-to-day basis, you can always ask, because it's almost, and this is borderline my opinion, but I guarantee you that they either know someone who has gone through an issue in terms of discipline, or they have gone through one themselves. And so being able to kind of pull from those experiences is really important. Now, if you're, looking at one specific city or one specific state, it might be best to then target some of those advocacy groups who are doing the work on the ground, because a lot of the times the people that are doing that work are in direct communication with families who have the biggest grievances. But it's not to say that they're the only people who have dealt with discipline in some way. And often you'll want to find people who aren't the figureheads of a movement or a conversation or a topic or even a policy. You want to find everyday folks who can tell you that story. Now, when you actually sit down and you find those people and those families, just leaving space is really important, right? You can always go in with a set of questions that you hope to get answered, but having a couple conversations where you're not the mastermind of that conversation is really helpful to keep in mind. If you have the time to do this, is what I'm going to emphasize in all of what I'm saying right now. But if you have the time, take a couple conversations just to get to know who they are, where they came from, what they're going through, without you going in and saying, tell me about the worst day of your student experience, right? And especially if they're younger, a lot of kids may not know that they might be dealing with some adultification or bias from adults, right? Like they just don't know. They maybe have never even heard the term before. And so really just trying to get down to basics of like, okay, what happened to you? How did it make you feel? If you're out of school, what do your grades look like? How are you feeling? Are you feeling any sort of lack of confidence from the situation, but not saying it so bluntly, of course. But like, those are the types of the things that you can ask to really get at, this is how this child is being impacted by this policy or this disciplinary action.
Thank you. Thank you. And Jessica, what strategies have you found to be most useful for you?
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar. To find sources, I go to a lot of attorneys who work with children, who represent them through like expulsion cases. I go to education advocates, disability advocates, youth groups to find families. One thing I do because we are talking about a really difficult situation oftentimes with the student, is to make sure there is parental consent and that they're okay talking to me. And then I have that initial interview or conversation, like Cheyenne said, where it's less so about describe what it was like getting suspended, what happened that day, but more let me get to know you, and you can ask me any question you want about my reporting. And I try to be really transparent when it comes to, here's what the reporting is going to look like. Like, it's going to take time. I'm going to need your school records, your 504, your IEP, any attendance records, and here's why. Here's how I'm going to use them. Here's what this could look like. Here's what it would be like if a photographer is with you. So that way they're aware of what they're kind of signing up for. And I think it's really important to approach the situation with empathy, because we are talking about kids, and making sure that, you aren't pressing them too much if they don't want to answer something, and giving them some kind of control that you would normally give a source like a government official. I think that's really helpful in terms of building trust. And I also have, some of the families I'm in contact with, they wanted to participate, like in my first story, but they weren't quite ready yet for whatever reason. And so I've stayed in contact with them, and the goal is to eventually do a story on them. And so it's really about building a relationship and trust with them, so that, when the time comes, they feel comfortable sharing their story with you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
Sorry, Michelle, can I just
Yeah,
add
go
one
ahead,
more
go ahead,
point?
go ahead.
So yeah, and also to that point, parent consent is great, absolutely required. I mean, you should do that. What I will say in terms of like a practical question you can ask any student that you're interviewing, whether on this topic or not, is, our team likes to say, tell me about a time when you felt this way, or tell me about a time when you wanted to do this thing. And those sort of anecdotal questions are great with, especially with younger kids, because they may not be able, like I said before, like not be able to internalize, what's actually happening, or look at the bigger picture of what's actually happening. Even some teens may not care or even think to look at the bigger picture. And so getting them to just like say how they're feeling and in that way is great.
And I'll add to that, being broad with your questions is actually beneficial in this type of situation. When you're asking about a suspension, I think when you don't want to come in with your own assumption of what happened or what led to them getting in trouble, or, any type of mental health issues they might be struggling with. And I think going broad allows you to kind of see what stuck in their mind about the situation, and then you could kind of jump off there, to kind of build your narrative.
Thank you both. I'm going to turn to some of these questions. We have one from Lacey Beveridge, who says, I work in Mississippi. A lot of the school districts here have policies where they suspend students for infractions like having a shirt untucked or uniform color that doesn't quite match official school colors. What does punishing a student for things like this do, not only to the student, but the family? And what does it accomplish for the school?
I will happily take that one as someone who's covered dress code policies. The biggest thing that I will say, like you ask, what does this accomplish for the school? A lot of the argument that I've heard schools say is, we're underlying issue is it's about control. It's also about, sometimes you'll hear, we're teaching them how to follow the rules, or we're teaching them how to abide by some, policy, or we're teaching them how to respect adults and what they say. And while that could be true, a lot of the times it's really just, uniform, right? The risk of not having these policies, and from a lot of teachers that I've spoken to, is higher than having them. And some of those things might look like, having students show up in a certain color all at the same time and indicate that they might belong to a sketchy group of some sort. And that seems to be some of the argument. And Rachel kind of alluded to this a little bit in terms of like talking about school violence. We talk about shootings and threats against other students. And this is where you might see some of that looped in. And kind of Rachel alluded to like how these are two different things that often are colluded in becoming one thing, when maybe they shouldn't be. And so, that's something that you can look out for, is just kind of what is the reasoning behind some of those policies. And you can definitely ask the school those questions if you don't know and if they're not upfront about it. The other thing in terms of how it impacts families, depending on what the policy is, especially when it comes to dress code and uniforms, this could be an issue of economic status too, right? Like if you don't have the money to provide a uniform, I know there's programs out there that provide free uniforms and free cleaning of those uniforms and similar efforts to help with some of that. But it might just be something that might be considered a burden for a family. For students, I know I've heard this complaint from quite a few students within the LGBTQIA community, where it might squash individualism or might squash their identity, or feel like they're not being able to express who they are through clothing or through hairstyle or through accessories. And so you might see some of that kind of interlaced in some of those policies, not only in Mississippi, but across the US.
And we have a question here that kind of touches on some of the things that Jessica talked about. And I don't know if Rachel or Jessica, you wanted to talk about it. It says, Jessica Clark says, one thing I hear from staff is, I don't want to suspend kids, but I just need the kid out of the classroom because they're so disruptive. And what does research and reporting say about how those concerns should be responded to?
I will let Rachel maybe talk about like solutions to that, but I think, that is something we're hearing with the staffing shortages. So the teachers' aides, the special ed specialists, and mental health providers, they're often the ones who would take the student out of the classroom and have them come sit in their office to talk or to regulate their emotions. We see schools are also having like deregulation rooms, which can look like they have like a beanbag chair on the floor or like swings or something, so that the student can kind of calm down and regulate their emotions again and be ready to go back into the classroom without that behavior. But what I've heard is, with the staffing shortages, being able to do that is a lot more difficult now.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I don't have any cheap solutions, and I think this is the problem, is that like suspending kids, allowing schools to suspend kids, doesn't cost any money, but investing in like these staffing issues, investing in training costs money. And so, I think we need to acknowledge that teachers are being put in a tough position and they do need more tools, but I think we really need to continue to emphasize that these tools are harmful to those students. They don't work. They're not going to have any positive impact on those students. And we need to empower teachers with effective tools, with constructive tools.
I will say I have seen one like case study, if you will. I went to San Carlos Apache Reservation and went to a elementary school there that had I am blanking on actually what the actual room is called, but they have a room where they allow students to take naps and talk to a counselor and get some quiet time and space away from the classroom. And that has actually, proven in that case to lower suspensions, because it's not the first step that they go to, but also just help build those relationships that we had talked about earlier. A couple of the students that I interviewed who had gone through and utilize this room, they have snacks, they have washers and dryers to clean clothes if that's a deterrent for students to come to school. So they do provide in a lot of ways addressing some of these basic needs, but also some of the mental needs of students throughout the day. School can be really draining and exhausting for a lot of students in a lot of different times of the year. And so this space was actually really helpful in addressing a lot of this. And as a result, they did see less punishment of their students for that reason.
Thanks. That's a really fascinating example. And Jenny Schultz sort of asked a question that you're essentially answered with this, but I don't know if Rachel or Jessica would want to highlight others, and that's have you done reporting on specific interventions districts that are promising that we should look into? So obviously that's one. I don't know if there's anything else that Rachel or Jessica would want to highlight.
I'd say there's pretty compelling data coming out of Chicago Public Schools and their implementation of restorative justice that I think is worth unpacking more. They come to mind as an example of how to do this well. And they're seeing some pretty positive outcomes.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you mentioned, Rachel, when we were speaking earlier, that they got a boost from some, I don't know if it was federal or state funding that may not be available for others. So it's kind of like,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
tough. They had a grant from the Department of Justice, that a grant program that doesn't exist. New York City has also shown some promise in their reduction of suspensions and restorative justice based on the empirical literature, at least. I'm not sure how educators would talk about it. There can sometimes be a disconnect, I know.
yeah. And maybe we'll just ask a couple more questions because we're almost at the end of our time. But Adriana Gutierrez says, what are the requirements for school districts after they expel students when it comes to academic instruction, specifically thinking about students with disabilities?
So I'm not sure, particularly in Colorado, what it is. I know that some of the school districts have expulsion schools that kids can go to, but then the question is, so if they go to the school, like, what does it look like? Is it the same standard that they might have gotten at their traditional school? And that's a big question. And it gets kind of to this deeper issue that some of my sources keep bringing up is, you know, how does a kid have a right to education after they are disciplined and expelled? And when in what does that look like?
And I
Yeah,
want to just, oh, sorry.
go ahead,
I'll just,
Rachel.
I'll just quickly say that this is a matter of state policy and it will almost certainly differ by states. Your right to a public education in the US is enshrined in state constitutions, not our national constitution. Our national constitution says nothing about education, and federal law is mostly about civil rights. And so if it is a student with disabilities, I would have a big question about whether that's a violation of federal civil rights law, because they're guaranteed a free and access to a free and public education. But if you want to understand this is going to vary by state, and it's going to be a question of state law.
Yeah, my only point was like this is where some districts do, tout expulsion schools, alternative schools. There's several different names for different secondary places that kids can learn. I would challenge some of what that curriculum looks like or what that day's instruction looks like. A lot of times it's here's everything that you missed. Good luck. And other times it's more hands-on, one-on-one work, but from the families that I've spoken to, it seems to be few and far between, but it's worth looking into, what sort of schools and programs students have access to once they are disciplined.
So I'm going to read out one more question here, and then I'm going to ask all of you as we close to maybe share your ideas for story ideas and areas of exploration that you think would be promising in this moment we're in 2025. But this final question is from Marianne Martin, who says, there are two questions that Marianne has. One is, did any of you do any reporting about charter schools versus regular public schools? Would also love to hear more about younger kids, special needs, and suspensions. And just as an FYI, I'm a journalist, but also have a 5-year-old neurodivergent biracial child. And we've been stunned at how our charter school has responded to his needs.
I have not done research from public to charter, but I have looked at some private school policies, which differ in a myriad of ways, especially, just what legislation or sorry, not legislation, what enforcement policies they are required to follow compared to their public counterparts. So that's absolutely when, Michelle mentioned like what sort of stories that we might do in the future. Like I would definitely look at private schools in terms of discipline.
Yeah, I haven't, I mean, charter schools is a big umbrella. And so it sort of really depends on the charter school. There's good research on quote unquote no excuses schools, which have sort of very rigid disciplinary standards and the harm that can befall students who are exposed to those types of educational environments. The other just point to keep in mind is that unlike private schools, which that was going to be my answer too. Like, I think we really need to be looking at private schools as vouchers expand in states across the US. But charter schools are public schools in the sense that they still have to abide by federal civil rights law and state civil rights law. And so that's important to keep in mind too, is that there are stronger protections for students, and accountability mechanisms might not be working everywhere in terms of making sure that they are abiding by the law. But that's something to keep in mind as you're engaging and thinking about these issues.
Okay. And just my final question to all of you is what, other story ideas you all would think either, things we're overlooking or just some really rich areas for exploration.
Yeah, I wrote a handful of stories about a kid who was going through some hair discrimination policies and such. And also to Erin's point in the chat, I do think that this does lend itself to much deeper conversation about what sort of rules are actually required to then successfully educate students in a classroom. And in a lot of cases, like I've mentioned already, some of these are, the argument is, oh, it's to prevent mass cases of violence in the school, and it's about safety. You'll also hear the complaint, or not the complaint, but the justification that in order to keep everybody on a level playing field, there needs to be some sort of structure and order, right? There's a lot of arguments to this that are across the board, but the question from journalists shouldn't be, why do you have this policy? It should be, is this policy beneficial? And without this policy, I should say, without this policy, would you still be able to adequately educate students? And if the answer is, yeah, you don't need the policy, then that's a bigger question and a bigger story that we should definitely be looking into across the industry, in terms of private and public and charter and all of the schools.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead. I was just going to call on you, Jessica. Yeah.
I think other stories that can look into is, are districts changing their discipline policy as they're struggling with staffing? I haven't found that yet with some of the districts I've talked to, but that might be something that's happening in other states. I think also another thing, as was mentioned, looking how do charter and private schools differ when it comes to suspending kids versus public schools, especially as we're seeing more students are enrolling into private schools nationwide. And I think something else to look into is kind of unofficial suspensions and what's happening there, where kids aren't maybe officially being suspended, but they are being removed from school.
Thank you, Jessica. And Rachel, what ideas would you share that you feel maybe are flying under the radar?
Yeah, I'd second the unofficial suspensions. I think informal discipline that's not recorded is a much bigger issue than we understand, especially in places where schools are not supposed to be suspending kids by law. So you shouldn't take it as a given that if the state has a suspension ban or the city has a suspension ban, that schools are adhering to that suspension ban. There's plenty of research showing in Arkansas, for example, in the Philadelphia school district, that when schools were told that they can no longer suspend students, they still did. And there's not clear accountability channels for how what you do then as a parent. And so I think that's a continuing story to focus on. And then something else that I think is worth paying attention to. I'm really interested in the sort of the politics of teachers unions being behind rolling back suspension reform and being sort of pro punitive approaches. And I think that's worth entangling too, because you usually think of teachers unions as sort of being on the side of students. And in this case, I think there are some examples, like in Nevada comes to mind, where they clearly weren't.
Yeah, thank you to all of you. And I want to highlight something that all three of you touched on earlier, this idea of the intersection between race and disability and mental health issues. And you've all been delving into that, and it just seems like really rich territory. And, these things are happening every day. And I feel like they kind of can fade into the background. So I'm just so happy to have all of you here on this webinar. And I think probably the best thing we could do is to just keep looking at these things because they're so important for shaping a child's trajectory. I want to thank Cheyenne, Jessica, and Rachel, and to the audience for all of their great questions. And I want to thank our content editor, Ryan White, and our communication strategist, Abs Mandar Bishu, for their role in our webinar today. We'll be emailing you a survey asking for your feedback on today's program and for your ideas and other topics of interest. Please take a moment to complete it. Also, I got a number of questions in the Q&A about, will this be recorded? How do I get a copy? We will email you a link, and you can also find it a little later today on centerforhealthjournalism.org. And we also urge you to help support these webinars. You can find more information here on how to do that. And thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.